Welcome back to another episode of That Fitness Couple. Today, we are joined by Dr. Rachele Pojednic. She's a respected expert researcher, global speaker, thought leader in nutrition and exercise science. She is the founder of Strong Process and the director of scientific research for Restore Hyper Wellness. She holds a faculty appointment at Stanford University and is the director of education at Stanford Lifestyle Medicine. Dr. Pojednic actively engages in cutting-edge scientific research, advocates for evidence-based health practices, and empowers individuals to make informed decisions about their well-being. Dr. Rachele, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we are excited to speak with you today. And just before we were getting on, you were mentioning how you have 18 years of research background, which is absolutely amazing. Corey Beth knows that I am quite the nerd when it comes to research, and so I was really excited to have these discussions with you today, and we definitely want to get into some of the research that you did. However, I thought maybe a really good place to kick this off was with a recent article and post you put up. I know Corey Beth was excited to talk about this topic, as well as many of our female clients, which has to do with the female menstrual cycle and how that factors into one's exercise routine.
Yeah, I thought maybe you would go in this direction. So I'm excited to unpack this a little. So, when we think about women's health, one of the things that we know is that there is very little research out there. So one of the more shocking facts that gets thrown around is that only 6% of research is done in the human performance space on females alone. So there's a little bit more if you add in mixed cohorts. So they studied men and women at the same time, but only 6% looking at just a female cohort. So there is just a huge vacuum of information, and the world will fill a vacuum when it is there. And so there's a lot of people that are speaking in the fitness space that I think very genuinely are really well-intentioned, right? They want to know more, they want to understand more. And the unfortunate part is some of the stuff is either just getting misinterpreted or in some cases just kind of made up because we just don't have the answers. And so the post that I put up was specifically about cycle syncing and whether we should be augmenting or changing our training as women around the different phases of our menstrual cycle. And for a while, we honestly didn't know the answer to that. And I think that's why people started to experiment with it, because if you're a woman, you feel differently in those different phases. And so intuitively, it just kind of made sense. Like, yeah, sure, we should track our cycle. Maybe we should change what we're up to. And as it turns out, the data is not moving in that direction, which, to be completely honest, I'm really excited about. Because, yeah, as I put in the post, if I have to perform during my luteal phase, or I need to compete during a time where my hormones aren't particularly optimized, I don't want that to hurt my mental game, right? Where I'm going in and I'm like, I'm not at my best. So therefore, I kind of give myself a mental out. So I'm actually really excited that the data is kind of moving in this direction of, no, train hard, listen to your body, but stay on your plan.
I loved this so much. And in fact, I loved in the article how you laid out the 4 phases, which I actually feel like most women don't even know. Would you just take a moment and walk us through the 4 phases and generally how we feel during those periods?
Yeah. So when we start with our phases, we're going to start always with a menstrual phase. So that's kind of like the first part of our cycle. And that is going to be when women are menstruating, right? So when you have your period. And in those cases, you're sometimes feeling great and sometimes you're not feeling so awesome. And so that's kind of what kicks it off. And it typically is going to last about, 5 days on average. And when we move out of our menstrual phase, we are then going to end up in what we call the follicular phase. And this is going to be where we see a significant rise in estrogen, right? So we see these curves all the time. And this is a phase And I know this is how I feel after I have my period. I'm like, man, I feel great. Like I feel light, I feel hydrated, everything feels bouncy and like I can do anything. And so that might have something to do with the estrogen rise in that case. And so a lot of people were saying like, this is a good time for you to like hit a big lift or to be in a competition. Unfortunately, we can't time this, right? And then after your follicular phase, so about halfway through your cycle, which is typically about 28 days, you're going to ovulate, right? And so this is when estrogen is at its peak. And people would say like this ovulation time period is where like you are going to be at your optimal because your estrogen is so high, right? It's like the secret sauce for women. No, it's not really playing out in the literature either. But then the next 14 days after ovulation, you're going to end up in your luteal phase. And this is when estrogen starts to come down, progesterone starts to go up. And this is where most women start to feel cramping. They feel a little blah. They feel tired. They feel bloated. And so this is the phase where people are like, I love this in the sort of, Instagram or social media phase. It's like, this is when you should do your nap yoga, like take it easy. Don't be working too hard, right? And this never hit me right. Just kind of like as a human being, I'm like, you know what? Like, screw you that I can't do a big heavy lift for half of the month. Like I'm not supposed to do hard things for half of the month. To me, it's like a little like it feels like it's like putting women down, like you are not capable in this second half of the month. That's kind of the interpretation that I had. And so for me, I was always kind of like, that doesn't really seem to make physiologic sense. And there's some really, really, really good data that's starting to come out that shows it doesn't hold true for strength training. It doesn't hold true for performance. It doesn't hold true for muscle building and for, scoring PRs. And so again, the thing that we have to really pay attention to as women is how do I feel during these phases? Not where's my estrogen at? It's fun to know, probably, something to consider there, but how am I feeling? And then adjust your training accordingly. And that's, I'm a strength coach by training way back in the day. That's how you would adjust your training anyways. Like if your athlete shows up and they're just not there, you're not going to have them hit a max PR that day because it's just not safe and it's not going to happen and it's not going to be good for their mental game. So you adjust accordingly. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the literature is you can hit gains, you can hit PRs, you can have, increases in muscle hypertrophy regardless of the phase, but the way that you're feeling is probably going to have much more of an impact on the way that your training is going.
It's such a great common sense approach, and I appreciate it so much because we've always had this question. And I know you've struggled with this in the past where women are like, oh, I have my period, like I shouldn't train. And Mike's like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't want to be insensitive, but also get to the gym. Like, what are you doing? Or we'll have trainers, male trainers that will ask. And I'm like, listen, yeah, I feel a bit weaker, right, during my period. But, so you could scale back a little bit on weight. I love that your article said we're not going to lose out on the ability to build muscle. You just have to listen to your body. Now, I do have two questions for you that kind of tangent off from this. And the first is for women that are maybe using an IUD and they don't get their period. I know the answer, but I think hearing it from a doctor is better. Do you still go through those changes over the course of a month?
So because it depends on the type of IUD that you're taking or if you're taking oral contraceptives, right? So if you're taking the copper if you have the copper IUD, you're going to have a normal cycle because it's not impeding or changing your hormones. It's basically making a zone that is not sperm friendly, right? But if you have a hormonal contraception, whether it's an IUD or it is your oral contraceptive pill, you're going to have a pretty steady amount of estrogen and progestin depending on what your either IUD or your prescription is. So you're not going to have those massive fluctuations like you would in a normal cycle. And then when you stop taking it, for example, when you are taking the oral contraceptive, that's what they call a breakthrough bleed, right? So it just basically means that estrogen is going to drop because you have stopped taking it. And so oftentimes when women have an IUD, they actually stop menstruating or they have like very, very, very short menstrual cycles. And it's just because you're getting that constant infusion. You will get a little more variation with an IUD, just simply because it is not as controlled when you stop taking the pill, for example, but you would have a really similar experience. A lot of women don't take those 7 days off where they take that sugar pill. It'll be a really similar experience in both of those situations.
Okay, no, that's great information. And then the second question, final question, I'll throw it back to you is, then we go through menopause, and after that period, are there still fluctuations we experience with hormones?
That's a great question. And this is probably where there is a major, major, major dearth of research. Is we actually have a fair amount of research on women that are clearly postmenopausal. And then we've got a bunch of research on women, and I'm talking within that 6%, right? So when I say a bunch, I mean, it's still pretty small, on younger women. Where we are missing so much data is that sort of like 40 to 55 age range, right? And so I'm going to answer your question about menopause in just a second, but what we're really, really not sure about is perimenopause. And so this is where those cycles start to go absolutely sideways, right? So we start seeing, where you normally had perhaps in your 30s a fairly consistent cycle, or, at least consistent, fairly consistent for most women. You start to get into your late 30s, early 40s, and everything's like, what is happening? And it's really fascinating when we look at the amount of literature. People are either interested in studying young women that are consistent, or to answer your question, postmenopausal women who are consistent, because basically they have no hormones left, right? So when you look at somebody that is postmenopausal, their estrogen levels are practically at zero. So when you take if you go get your hormones tested postmenopause, so this is a year after your last menstrual cycle, usually it's around age 51 or so on average. You're just not making estrogen anymore. And there's a whole host of things that happen because of that as well. But this transition period of the cycle getting very irregular, estrogen levels starting to decrease and decrease and decrease, it doesn't just happen overnight where you just flip a switch and all of a sudden you're premenopausal and then you're postmenopausal. There actually is this very long transition period here. And that's the big question mark, because the research never focused on this cohort of women. When you look at the data, it's either under 40 or over age 65 on average. So it's really fascinating, this massive gap right in the middle.
So interesting. No, thank you so much for answering that question. I feel like that's going to be helpful for a lot of clients, that there's nothing crazy different we have to do, during our cycles. I happen to be in that phase right now of not a lot of research. And the craziest thing is, since eliminating, sugar, most alcohol, almost all alcohol, and white wheat from my diet, my periods actually are more regular now than they ever have been before. So it's so crazy just to even see the role that nutrition plays on your ability for your body to do what it was divinely designed to do. But great information. And I think very empowering for women. Can I say one more thing?
Go for it.
I want to talk to you all day. We're going to pretend Mike's
Should I walk
here.
out of here? Should I just leave you two alone?
Well, I love how you said, like, don't give me an excuse to not work out, or like, don't think that I'm weak or I'm not capable. What I think is actually so fascinating, and I wish I had done this sooner, to be honest, was I started to track my cycle and also how I was feeling. So I would write like, no motivation, fetal position, don't want to talk to people. And right now I'm in ovulation phase, so can't keep his hands off me. Very productive on social
media. Pitch a PR, woman.
Yeah.
It's so crazy, right? You feel prettier, right? There's all these things that happen. But in tracking that, I was able to say, like, okay, I have a lower energy week that could potentially be coming up, just planning ahead for it. So batching a little bit of social, or, not having major podcast interviews, whatever it is. Like you said, you're not going to stop living, which I think is ridiculous, that some people think like, oh, guess I just don't have to show up for work half the month. Like, no, you have to keep being a functioning member of society. Just knowing yourself helps you plan for it. And that has been such a helpful thing. So I really appreciate your insights. That article was awesome.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I think about it as a woman that's in that sort of like middle period as well. I totally feel you. But The other people that I think about all the time, I work with a lot of female athletes, right? And I work with a lot of female, like first responders, firefighters, war fighters, right? And this is something that like, it's kind of fun for us to talk about if we're just training for the sport of life. Like, oh, I'm tracking my cycle and I need to, take it easy for a week. And that's just really critical. But I think about these like really high stakes type of environment where, let's say, you're an elite level Olympic athlete and your final for your race or your game or whatever falls in that week after ovulation. Like, you not only have to know that it's coming, to your point, Corey Beth, but you also have to have a plan for like when you can't actually take that light week, right? And I think about this with my athletes and my first responders, my warfighters, is you also have to practice during that time period to like push a little bit hard too. I think, again, my warfighters and my firefighters, like, okay, let's say you're 5 days after ovulation and you got to run into a burning building and save a baby, right? Like, you're not going to sit down on the sidewalk and be like, I can't, I'm 5 days after ovulation, right? So like, there are some real high stakes situations. And this is, I think, where I was originally getting my backup, where I was just like, yeah, it's important for me, but it's also really important for these women that are doing some super impressive physical things, that they have to be ready in these time periods when, the social media world is like, you should just take a nap today, use your bands, right? So I want to just emphasize for the women out there is like, yes, listen to your body and don't be afraid to go for it because you can.
So good.
Do you also believe that there is a big advantage to training hard during that phase, because like you just explained, there's going to be situations where you can't control the variables, right? You don't know what day an event's going to fall on, or some tragic event that somebody has to show up for. So wouldn't it be to someone's advantage to at least understand to have put themselves into this like max intensity environment when nothing is on the line, right? When the stakes aren't high, but your body will more or less adapt to those circumstances. So, I mean, is there like a training advantage, so to speak, to working through that phase?
Yeah, totally. So I'll think about it in two different ways. So I told you I was a strength coach. I've been teaching strength and conditioning, and I've been working in this space for, since I was just out of college. And one of the things that you're saying, I think, just lines up perfectly with this idea of periodization, right? So just like straight up, like 101 training is you set yourself up to have these periods of time where you're just going to be pushing really, really hard because that's part of the training, right? And then if I transition, now I teach at Stanford, I teach a sports nutrition course, right? So how we can modify our nutrition to help enhance our training, our competitions, as well as how to practice with nutrition during those periodized times. And so in those cases, what we use nutrition for is essentially two ways. One, enhance performance. So this would be something like utilizing a specific type of carbohydrate to help you sprint or to help you get through a really long run or a bike or something like that. But there are times when you are in a training period that's far away from your competition, your high stakes event, where we might actually deprive you of carbohydrates and ask you to train really hard so that you can train all of those metabolic pathways that are going to help you to maximize fat burning, right? So that way, when you get to your training period that's just before competition, this is the new hot buzzword, right? Like, you are metabolically flexible. You can use fat when you need to. You can rely on carbohydrates when you need to. And the reason that you are able to do that, as you point out, Mike, is that you trained it when there was low stakes, trained your body to experience these things that are stressful for it, so that when it counts, those adaptations were there for you.
What I also like in you mentioning periodization, I think it's important because I always believed that the concept was a bit overrated, that in the sense that, we're going to, in this phase, we're only going to focus on endurance. This phase, we're only going to focus on power or strength. And it's like, your muscles contract and they contract, they're using up energy, they're using up resources. They don't really decide that we're going to adapt this way or that way. It's more or less like you just train hard, and a lot of it is genetic inclinations. Or some people are going to, their genetic inclination is they're going to improve significantly more on the endurance front than the strength front, and vice versa. What I think is so practical about what you're saying is that no one has to get too cute with their training. It's like, put the focus on training hard. For us, we recommended 2 to 3 times a week as far as resistance training is concerned, right, to allow for greater recovery. And I definitely want to talk about that with you soon as well. But I think that, when we can keep things a little bit more simplistic and just understand that during these cycles, I'm not going to be at my peak. That's okay. Doesn't have to influence the way I train. But I think also what's really encouraging is that it's not going to influence your results in a negative way based off of what you're saying, is that it's not negatively influencing your strength overall. It's not negatively influencing your muscle development either, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I could not agree with you more, Mike. And this is like, I'm sure you roll your eyes at this one too, where everybody's like, oh, now we're only doing zone 2 training, right? Because it's like the new hot thing. And it's just like, come on, team. And people ask me all the time, like, what's the best kind of exercise for me at this stage of life, whatever. And I'm like, what do you like to do? How much time do you have? Like, get in there, do the work. That's what's going to matter the most. We have all these like tips and tricks and protocols and hacks that we have now. And I'm like, the basics, team, like that's what we need to be focused on. The basics, get stronger over time. You're going to be all right.
So good.
Well, and part of those basics has to do with recovery, because too many people put the emphasis on just the exercise component. I have to train hard. I got to be at the gym every day. And yet we know that's only, we know it's only one half of the equation, but it's not how most people approach this. It is that exercise as much as I possibly can mentality in order to get fit and lose fat. So talk to us a little bit more about where recovery fits into all this equation.
Yeah, it's critically important. So I've been studying muscle, has been my tissue since I started doing my research. And what we know about muscle is it likes to be stressed, and it also needs time to regenerate and rebuild, right? And if you don't give it that time, then you are not going to appreciate those adaptations that you're working so hard for in the gym, because you're simply not allowing that muscle to build the protein back in, regenerate the glycogen stores that it needs, make sure that the nervous system is reset, right? And so that time in between these training sessions is so critical to making sure that you are in fact seeing the progress that you are looking for. And I'll add not just rest time, but also really addressing your nutrition to those times as well. So one of the things that a lot of people that I've seen will do is they'll take a day off. And because they're taking that day off, they're like, oh, I can't eat, like I would have on a training day. And they end up in a low energy state. And that's also not serving the purpose of rebuilding and regenerating that tissue. So yeah, it is critically important to make sure you give your muscles time to rebuild in between those very purposeful sessions where you're doing some damage to that tissue.
I always love looking at fitness through the lens of stress physiology, right? Dr. Hans Selye, you probably know, he is the father of stress physiology, and he pointed out how all stress, whether we're talking about getting sick, mental stress, or exercise stress, follows this 3-step process of you have the alarm phase, which with exercise would be your workout. Then you have this stage of resistance where your body would actually be getting stronger. But then there's that stage of exhaustion. And that is when people are pushing it too far. And I think this is one of the hardest things for, especially a lot of women, I'm going to say, they have trouble with this concept because we've been taught, in order to get yourself fit, you need to be exercising every single day. You need to be putting in your 60 to 90 minutes. It's got to be a combination of resistance training and cardio and this and that and all the other things, and not recognizing that maybe part of the reason why they're struggling to see their results is because they've entered this stage of exhaustion, that their body is not fully compensated and overcompensated for the stress that they're putting on it. So is that something that you see, especially when you're working with a lot of these athletes, or as you mentioned, firefighters, military, where they are in a high stress situation almost all the time?
Yeah. So the concept that you're describing, if we were to put like physiologic terms behind it, is low energy availability, right? And so low energy availability can be almost accidental at times, right? Where your training is just completely blowing the needs of your physiology, your sort of like resting needs out of the water, and you're not compensating enough. So it can come from two different directions. It can either be kind of an overtraining situation where you're describing, it can also be an undernourishment situation, right? So, and oftentimes it's a combination of the two. And from that, that's exactly what we see. Is we see exhaustion, we see burnout, we see real physiologic consequences. So in a lot of my female athletes, to bring it back to the menstrual cycle, if they end up in that state, they stop menstruating. Like that is a key right there, that you are not getting what you need in order to support your training. It used to be kind of a badge of honor in a lot of runners and a lot of my war fighters too, is they would be like, oh, I'm not getting my period anymore. It's so great. And I'm like, no, team, it's not so great. Actually, that is your body screaming at you that something is wrong. And the term you alluded to it, Mike. The term that's going to come down in the socials, I'm pretty sure this is going to be the next hashtag. You heard it here first, is hormesis, right? This hormetic effect. And so hormesis in physiology means just a little stress and not too much. And exercise is a beautiful example of this, right? So we know if you sort of like create this normal curve, on one side, if you've got sedentary behavior, that's going to do really bad things for your physiology. All of the diseases of our time are really related to it. If you hit that perfect sweet spot, you're exercising well, your nutrition is dialed in, you're going to see all these really awesome physiologic changes because you have increased your heart rate, you've done a little muscle damage, you have increased your blood pressure and your core temperature, right? But if you do that too far, you end up on the other side of that curve. You end up overtrained, you end up in low energy availability, you end up in disease states that you didn't see coming, chronic inflammation, injury, because you have not dialed in those two components together. And that's kind of like really where my work lives, is like, how do we dial in exercise and nutrition? And then I'll add in a little bit, all of the work that we do at Restore with Restore Labs is also using this hormetic effect to help people recover a little bit faster and better as well.
Wow. I love this so much. Well, again, every woman, I need to lose fat 7 days a week. I'm like, no. I mean, where did that even come from? I mean, Suzanne Summers? Like, I don't know. I don't know where that came from. It's ridiculous, though. The answer is no.
Regarding the hormesis, I think this is a great conversation too, because we're talking about recovery, but I know that you've done some research into, and I guess this is what you're doing on the Restore side, is into different modalities that we can use for recovery. And so can you explain what some of those modalities are?
Yeah, so my work most recently has been looking at all the fun things that we're seeing on social media, right? So things like red light therapy, infrared sauna, cryotherapy, cold plunge, compression. And what we're seeing is that all of these modalities actually operate under this hormetic principle, right? So they are actually going to do something to your body to stress it out a little bit. Your body overcompensates for that little bit of stress, and then it results in increased antioxidant capacity, increased recovery from inflammation. There are other outcomes that we can talk about with each of the different types of therapies, but it really does go right to this concept of a little bit of stress, not too much, and not too little. And we're seeing some really interesting outcomes. It's funny, the reason that I was hired at Restore, so I lead up their Restore Labs division, which is our lab right at our headquarters. And the reason why I was brought on is because everybody's talking about all of these therapies, and there's kind of what I would consider an absence of evidence in this space, right? Where you start to go and dig around on PubMed and you start to try and find the actual literature, and it's like, wow, there's only a couple studies here and a couple studies there, but we're saying all of these things like this is evidence-based, it's based on science. And one thing that to Restore's credit is they called me and they were like, you study things that are hard to study that are really related to our work. We want to be a part of the solution here. We want to actually spin up a lab and do the research, like good, well done clinical trials to figure out whether or not this is working. You have a great Rolodex. You've got a bunch of academic institutions that want to help and want to partner with us. Would you be interested? And I was like, hell yeah, let's do it. Like, let's do something fun and interesting that can really help good people. And so, yeah, that's what I've been working on for the last 2.5 years.
That's exciting because we do see this as like a budding industry. So within the fitness industry now, even we have been approached by different companies who have now set up these recovery labs, if you will, and they're practicing all of these things. So from compression to cryo to cold plunges to, you name it. And it's interesting, but as you said, there's like this absence of evidence. And we know that one of the pieces of evidence that did recently come out, which is not necessarily a positive, was that doing cold plunges post-workout, post-resistance training workout, actually attenuates some of the potential results. And so you want to just explain where I'd love to go with this, though, is like, where then does the recovery components fit in? And maybe you can get into some of the specific ones. What's okay to do when?
Yeah. I'll go straight to that cold plunge one. It's really funny. When cold plunge first became super hot, it's probably mid-COVID, right? Where everybody was like, had nothing better to do. And they were all dunking themselves in the middle of a river in the middle of the winter. Every exercise physiologist that I talked to at the time, we were all like, this makes no sense whatsoever to do this right after a workout. And there's a couple of like really prominent chains and gyms that started to put them in their facility, and like everybody was hitting a really heavy lift and then getting into the cold plunge. And the reason why exercise physiologists were like all like laughing in the background and just shaking our heads is because we all know that if you blunt that inflammatory response that you have just induced by doing your bicep curls or your squats or your, deadlifts or whatever, then basically what you do is you put a veil in between that damaged tissue, the muscle, and the immune system that needs to recognize where that damage is to go and fix it. And so this data has been really out there for a long time in looking at NSAIDs, so things like Advil. So if you take a ton of Advil around your training, it's been, well documented that your, recovery is impaired, even though you might not be in pain right around your workouts, but you actually don't experience the benefit of those workouts. This is actually starting to come up with some of these super high dose supplements as well, these very anti-inflammatory supplements. I won't call any out, but your powders, the green ones especially, are not getting really great data. And the reason is it's simple physiology is if you damage your tissue during this hormesis, a little bit of stress, not too much, and then you mask that damage, your body's not going to be able to fix it. And so that's what cold does. We've known this, like you get a bruise, you put some ice on it and it takes the inflammation down. And in that case, it's probably a good idea. But in the case of you've just damaged your muscles and you want your immune system to come back and build up that protein, you blunt that effect by jumping in the freezing cold river or in the new cold plunge you just installed in your backyard. And like, you're actually stopping that repair and regeneration. So there is utility in cold data or in cold therapies. But it's also important to know they act differently. And when we look at the cold data, everybody that's talking about cold plunge, when they look at that data and they're calling it out, they're looking at cold water swimmers. So they're not looking at cold plunge. There's almost no, as far as I know, there's no like consistent literature for cold plunge. It's just too new. Like there's just not data on it. So when we look at that data and people are like, oh, it reduces inflammation, it helps with all these things, happiness, mental health. It's all done in Scandinavian cold swimmers, like people that go on the weekends and they swim around together and they have a really good time. There is an emerging group of literature, and I'm not saying this because this is our modality. There is an emerging literature in cryotherapy, which actually works different than cold plunge. So cold plunge actually makes you very cold. It lowers your core temperature. There is this response of, there's the diver's reflex, right? Which really is going to change around your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system by lowering your core temperature, which is why it has this effect on muscle. Cryotherapy works really differently. You're in a cryo chamber for usually 2 to 3 minutes. And what it does is it acts on the nociceptors for the most part in your skin. And so it doesn't actually lower your core temperature. So there's some emerging literature that shows that timing of cryotherapy versus cold plunge is going to have different effects on athletic performance.
Wow.
Interesting. So how do you see it being used for the athletes, also the regular everyday individual?
Yeah, so there's two things I think that are really beneficial from cold therapy. The first one is what I would term the relaxation response and training that. So if you've ever gotten into a cold plunge, regardless of when you've trained recently or not, if you get in, the first thing you do is scream, right? And then the second thing you do, if you stay in, because you have to do this, is you have to start. You have to really start to slow everything down and breathe and relax, right? And what that does is it takes you from that super, super, super heavily induced fight or flight sympathetic response. And it starts to take the foot off of the accelerator and let your parasympathetic nervous system start to take back over. So why is this beneficial? Well, this is something that's been removed from our life at large right now, right? Like whoever you are, whether you're an athlete, a warfighter, or just an athlete of life, right? Our day-to-day is constant and nonstop, right? So if you think about all the stress research that we see, we are in fight or flight almost all day, every day. And only getting worse the more we look at our screens, the more we pay attention to so many things that are going around us that we don't have control over. And so this response, I actually feel like brings this practice, if you will, of how to take your foot off the accelerator when things are very stressful around you and get control. And I think that holds true for both cryotherapy and cold plunge. So I think that that's a really, really powerful thing that happens. The other thing that we're seeing, which is really interesting, that's helpful, is that it lowers chronic inflammation, right? So this is good. And this goes right to your question, Mike, about like, what do we think about dosing? When should we use it? What's the sort of schedule that we should be using it on? The most important thing with cryotherapy and cold plunge is that you shouldn't do it every day, right? We don't want to keep our inflammation super low all of the time, but that a couple times a week. So we're seeing in the data somewhere around 2 to 3 times per week. We just released a study at Restore that said 6 times per month. So it's like 1 or 2 times per week is where that threshold is to reduce chronic inflammation without having that blunting effect of your training gains. And I think that holds true for both. I don't have really good data on cold plunge, but that it would make sense. The other thing is that you want to be doing it if you're going to hit a big number or you're going to hit a big lift or you're going to do a big training, either do it well before. So I would say like, if you're going to do a big training at, 4 or 5 in the afternoon, do your cold in the morning on that day, or wait somewhere between 24 to 48 hours after and then get into that cold plunge, which is not the way that people are practicing it right now. They were often like training and then getting right into the cold. I'd say either do it before. It does seem to be, the data shows that if you do it before, it doesn't affect those gains and it might actually help them. And then wait about 24 hours to 48 hours afterwards.
That's so helpful. And what I'm wondering about too is the compression therapy as well as infrared. Those I feel like are also newly popular.
Yes, I love infrared and red light. I'll package these two together. So these are just two different wavelengths of light. Infrared is non-visible. So if you get into an infrared sauna, you can't see it. It just kind of like heats you up from the inside out, so that wavelength of the light that you can't see penetrates deeply into your skin and then into your kind of internal organs, and it will warm you up starting in the inside out. This is different than like a traditional Finnish sauna. You've probably been in these before. You get in and it's like from the outside in, it's super, super hot in the room. If you get in an infrared sauna, they don't get much hotter than like 100, 120, 130 degrees. You get into a Finnish sauna and they can be upwards of 170, 180 degrees, super hot. So that infrared sauna penetrates very deeply, and it acts almost exactly like exercise in your body, which is super fascinating. So we actually call it an exercise mimetic. So what that means is that it increases your core temperature, it increases your heart rate, increases your blood pressure, it vasodilates all of your blood vessels. And by doing that, what we're seeing in the literature is that it's really impactful for cardiovascular outcomes, as exercise is. So it's really helpful in preventing risk of heart attacks, stroke, high blood pressure. The only thing that it doesn't do, and I see this oftentimes, and I have to often call it out, is it does not burn extra calories. So unlike exercise,
It is not a replacement, people. It is not a replacement for your exercise program.
100% not a replacement for your exercise program. So you do want to, be thoughtful. And the good thing with heat is it seems to be great at any time. So this one you don't have to pay attention to whether or not it's before or after. The heat seems to be fine, and it doesn't seem to impair any kind of gains afterwards, which makes sense because you're not inducing this anti-inflammatory effect and you're not vasoconstricting, you're vasodilating, so bringing more blood to the tissues. So that's kind of going to be like the biggest impact is infrared. And then you go down to red light, which is a slightly lower wavelength. And this one's really fascinating. And this one, I think we're going to start to see a lot more data coming out on red light therapy. We are a little bit out over our skis on a lot of the claims that are being made right now, but the physiology actually does seem to hold up, both in cell and animal models as well as in humans. Red light penetrates much more shallow into your skin and just below the surface of your skin, depending on the intensity of that light itself. And what we're finding, which is really fascinating, and this is both in human and animal data, is it seems to have a direct impact on your mitochondria itself, where it makes that mitochondria, interestingly, actually increase reactive oxygen species for the very short term, which forces your body to overcompensate with some of these antioxidants, which has kind of a lasting effect after you step out in front of the light. So that one is super fascinating. And the other place, which I actually think is kind of fun, again, as a woman of a certain age, is we are seeing, and this is pretty well documented in the derm literature, that it does seem to have benefits for your skin as well. The question about like all these cuckoo masks and stuff that we're seeing, and the red light underneath the eyes and all that, it doesn't seem to be in the literature yet. Although I am partnering with a couple of companies to start to maybe do some of this research, it doesn't seem yet that those intensities of the light are strong enough to have that effect. The derm effect really comes from lasers, and most of the commercially available ones that you will see are LED lights, so that matters too.
That's amazing.
It's fascinating. You know what this entire genre actually reminds me of? It reminds me of bodybuilding in the beginning. You had bodybuilders who were just doing things, getting results, and there was no real science behind it, but it was like there was proof. But it took us a really long time to dial it in and figure out, okay, what is the proper dosage though? Because you have guys who are dosing with lots of drugs, who are promoting, high volume routines, multiple days a week, and these guys are becoming mass monsters. And then you have those of us who are on like the natural side of things, where, I haven't trained more than 90 minutes in an entire week in terms of resistance training for the last 25 years. But at a high intensity, and finally learning that, okay, there is a proper dosage here that, if I go over it, I start to regress. If I'm under it, I'm not really seeing any type of gains. But that's, I feel like, where we are right now with so many of these modalities is, okay, we know there's something there. We know that there's going to be a hormetic response, but we just haven't dialed in yet the dosages or the timing of all of it.
Well, and we didn't do compression therapy.
Oh,
that was the last one. I'm so curious about that. We actually had the opportunity to speak at an event, and right next to us was a table where they had, compression for your legs. They had the boots. They had all these, hips. The hips felt amazing. I mean, it felt incredible, but I'm like, I'm not exactly sure scientifically. I haven't gotten on board with any of this stuff, just because honestly, and maybe it's because like the jury is still out on some of it. I've had a red light therapy facial. It was fantastic. I'm not going on Amazon to go get a, mask probably made in China that just has a red bulb in it that you think it's more than it is. Cold plunging, not really attractive to me, not into it. Maybe cryotherapy, like I've seen a few people do it. But I will say, having experienced the compression therapy, what does the research say on that?
Yeah. Compression therapy, I would say, is probably one of the better researched therapies. And the reason is simply because it's got so many applications, whether it's wellness or clinically, right? So we look at people that have circulation issues. We think about somebody that has lymphatic circulation issues. This often happens in different cancers, right? So they've been using these tools across the spectrum for a long period of time. So when you go and look at this, you actually start to see that there's some pretty good data. I would say the most important thing that happens with compression therapy is essentially movement of fluids, right? So that's really going to be the benefit here. If you put the boots on or something like that, what you can feel is that it is sort of generative. It will start in your ankles, and then you'll start to feel the compression move up through your knee and then up for your hips. And what we're seeing is that movement, mostly because if you just think about gravity, right, that often you just have a hard time pushing all of that back up into circulation. So it can just be really helpful for moving things that are a little bit stale and stagnant, that are down, being held by gravity into your legs. And if you look at this in clinical data, like the most extreme version that you would see is somebody that has like really aggressive edema in their ankles and in their feet. So their ankles and their feet might be super, super puffy. When they put these compression systems on, they can actually start to move that liquid, whether it's water or lymph or blood, away from those areas where it's pooled. And that seems to be one of the major benefits. It essentially just improves circulation. The other thing that might be happening is that you might have this sort of compensatory anti-inflammatory effect, right? Where if all of these fluids are slightly pooled in your hips and in your legs, and you start to move them, it's going to just naturally reduce any kind of inflammation that might have been happening going along with that pooling, because inflammation is going to follow where things go wrong in your body, right? And so that is likely why people are seeing some lower levels of inflammation, is just simply moving fluid that shouldn't have otherwise been sort of stagnant there. The other thing is just, as you pointed out, like massage, it just feels really damn good, right? And massage, we know, for all the same reasons, if you put pressure somewhere, you're going to bring good blood to it. You're going to move any of the, waste products away. So all these things in combination, it's just a super simple, like no-brainer kind of therapy that can feel really good and have some like right away kind of impacts.
Do we know anything in terms of the relationship between using this modality in conjunction with resistance training or after training, prior to training? I mean, is there any like recommendations, if you will, in terms of how to utilize it?
Yeah, so there's I would say mixed evidence in compression and performance outcomes. So I would probably call it like half and half, show either no effect, right? So no next, strength training period effect, no hypertrophy effect, where it's like, you went in and you had two groups, half of them got compression, half of them didn't, and then they asked them to do something hard the next day. And the both groups kind of looked exactly the same. I'd say it's probably about 50% of the data looks like that. 50% of the data shows some benefit, right? So that's going to be, slight improvements in the, the lift that they asked you to do the next day. Where there isn't a lot of data, and this is something that I'm also focusing on in Restore, is exactly to your point, Mike, is like, what does this mean in the real world? It's something that I've been focusing a lot in the last couple of years, is all of these super, super tight randomized control trials that are done in the lab are awesome, like really important for understanding mechanism. Does it matter for me in real life is kind of the question that I am always seeking. And I started going down this path with my warfighters and my first responders, is like, okay, we're seeing all these interventions that are really helpful for inflammation. They're really helpful for recovery in the lab. Does it matter when you're in the field? Does it matter when you are a soccer player and you've got a tournament and you're playing 4 games in 3 days, right? And so there's very little data on that, right? Like, what does this mean for the real human or the real athlete or the real first responder? So that's another place that I think that the research really needs to start going is, okay, let's take what we're learning in the lab and apply it to real situations. And unfortunately, that data, really minimal.
It's a little bit of an aside here, but lateral to this, I guess you could talk about BFR training, right? So for those who are not familiar, blood flow restricted training, where you are actually putting the cuffs around different parts of your limbs, and it does provide some of like this compression type of response. But what's so interesting about it, and it's been used and highly researched, especially with regards to rehabilitation, is that for a lot of people, it is a great way to, train hard without having to train heavy, if you will. And I think that's what I think of those sometimes when we're talking about the compression stuff. I could kind of see it working in a similar fashion, but discussion for another day. That's a deep topic. Where I'd love to just kind of finish up here is it still with respect to recovery, how does supplementation play into all of this with respect to, your mind and your body?
Yeah. So my work, as I mentioned, is exercise and nutrition, and supplements really more than overall diet have been where I focused my work. So I started out with vitamin D, looked at CBD for a while. That CBD data was not inspiring, so I wouldn't waste your money there. Vitamin D, we did see some really good things specifically for muscle, which is exciting. But it brings me back to the point that you were kind of making just a second ago, Mike, and Corey Beth, you alluded to this as well, is you got to bake the cake first before you do any of this stuff, right? So like, Corey Beth, if you're not going in and doing your sauna and doing your red light and doing your cryo because you're like, I'm good, I'm training hard, I feel great, like, awesome, right? You got to bake that cake first. And I think what we do as a society at large is we're looking for all of these like tips and tricks and potions and hacks that are going to supersede the day-to-day. And supplementation often falls into this space, right? Where people will be like, oh, I'm just going to get my supplement stack and I'm going to feel great. No, you got to do the training and you got to dial in your nutrition first. And once that's there, then you can start to think about supplements. The supplements that work are going to be kind of boring, right? Like, take your multivitamin, make sure that your micronutrients that are essential are topped off. Vitamin D, pretty important. Omega-3s, your fish oil supplements, they probably are also important because they are essential, which means you must eat them. Your body can't make them. And most people don't eat enough, right? So if you don't eat a lot of fish, you're probably not getting enough of your omega-3s. So you just want to top that off. The one that I think is really interesting right now that is coming on strong, especially if we go back to women's health, is creatine. The data here is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And particularly what we know is that when we look at men and women, as they age, creatine levels start to go down. This is going to be the precursor to essentially replenishing ATP and those like very powerful types of activities. It's also, as it turns out, really important in the brain. And so creatine, most studied supplement on the face of the planet in men, particularly young men that are lifting weights. And so we're seeing now that, coming on strong in the space, that it's really beneficial for women. Women tend to have lower levels of phosphocreatine in their body naturally than men do, so it can really help there. They tend to lose it a little bit more over time, especially because women lose skeletal muscle over time more than men do. And so I would say if you wanted to do a fun one and you wanted to add that to your stack after you get, your micronutrients topped off, creatine is a really good option, 3 to 5 grams per day.
Awesome. I'm ordering it.
I mean, listen, I think it's really exciting. I mean, I remember when creatine first hit the market back in, I'm going to say it was like, now I'm going to date myself, like 94 or so. And that's when I started taking it and noticed an immediate impact. But to see now the benefits of it from brain health, I think is really, really fascinating. So I think it's exciting. And oh man, we could talk all day about it, but I know we cannot. So
I can just do a talk on supplements.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we will definitely have to do that.
Tell our audience where to find you.
You can find me on the socials at Rachele Pojednic. It's kind of a funny spelling, so you'll probably put it in the show notes. You can also, as you mentioned in my bio, I have direct to trainer and health coach education models based on all of my university teaching at Strong Process. And you can always come and find me at Restore Labs. If you go to restore.com/Restore Labs, you will find all of our awesome work on these new therapies.
Well, we will certainly link to all of that in the show notes. Rachel, this was absolutely a wonderful conversation. Enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for being here today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And get out there. Don't worry about what time of the month it is. Just do your training.